The first time I saw a proper synthesizer was in the early 1970s, and I saw Keith Emerson on TV performing on his Monster Moog system. Now my jaw just dropped looking at this amazing piece of equipment. I stared at the screen waiting for the camera to pan back to this wonderful piece of gear. Now my first, shall we say, real experience of synth sounds was the Doctor Who theme tune. Now wherever you are in the world, I am pretty sure you have heard the Doctor Who theme tune. It was written by Ron Grainer and realised by the amazing Delia Derbyshire. It came out in 1963 and no one had heard anything like this. This was before synthesizers had been invented. It was all done with oscillators and tape manipulation, an absolutely amazing piece of creative work. And I just loved the tune and the sounds that this produced. So I guess that sort of got me interested in synthesizers. Decades later, a thought popped into my head. I don't know if this happens to you, but I suddenly wondered why I was so fascinated by synthesizers, particularly modular synths. And I traced this back as best as I can to an early experience in my childhood. Don't all our childhood experiences affect us as adults? As a kid, I remember watching Hammer horror movies on the TV with my dad. Now, Hammer Horror was a UK movie studio. They made gothic horror movies and a lot of B science fiction movies. I'm sure they had worldwide distribution, so you may have heard of them. You may well have seen their movies back in the, 50s, 60s, 70s. I think it was a Saturday night when one of the TV channels showed a Hammer horror movie. They had some wonderful monster movies about Dracula and Frankenstein and the Wolfman, stuff like that. It wasn't that scary really, it was about the story rather than the slash harrow gore stuff that we get today in horror movies. But the thing which fascinated me the most were the scenes inside the mad scientist's laboratory. I just loved looking at the dials and the levers and the switches, and I just wanted to be there pulling them to see what would happen. I think I was in love with complexity for complexity's sake. I didn't really care what happened. I didn't want to run around pulling levers shouting, "It's alive, I tell you, it's alive!" No, I didn't. I really didn't want to do that. I was more fascinated by the machinery, the equipment, and what it could possibly do. I had no idea. That is one of the things which sticks in my mind. Mad scientists' laboratories. So when I saw Keith Emerson's Monster Moog, this possibly triggered a memory in the darkest recesses of my brain. All those knobs and switches, and I maybe made some sort of subconscious connection and just thought, wow, this is absolutely amazing. I want to get in there and twiddle the knobs and dials and see what happens. Now in the 70s, synthesizers were just really becoming a thing. It was difficult to get information about them. We didn't have computers, we didn't have the internet. How did we survive? I've no idea, but we did. So any book about synthesizers which came out, I used to buy that. I used to look at music magazines for information about synthesizers and keyboards, and some of them had one or two articles about them. And one magazine in particular, I think it was called International Musician, it ran a series of articles called The Synthesizer by, if I remember correctly, a guy named Tony Horseman. I apologise if I've not got the name correct. Anyway, I wrote to him because that's what you did before the days of email. And he wrote back and we had a few telephone conversations, and that's what we did with the telephone instead of texting people. He said he had a Roland System 700. This was Roland's answer to the Moog modular systems, and estimates about how many of these complete systems were actually built vary, but there were very few, somewhere between 40 and 80, I think. Probably today less than a handful, if that, actually exist in their entire form. Anyway, this was back around 1980, and he asked me would I like to see it. He lived an hour away, so I said yes, of course. I remember visiting him and being shown into his front room and seeing this massive synthesizer which filled a complete wall. This was awe-inspiring, jaw-dropping stuff, certainly at the time. And I knew a bit about synthesis because I'd been reading everything I could about it. I knew about oscillators and filters and envelopes and stuff like that. I hadn't a clue how this thing worked, but there were so many knobs and sliders and things to play with and things to adjust. I mean, I just absolutely fell in love with this. However, this probably cost, I don't know, a couple of houses at the time, the equivalent of. It was just not even in my sphere of possibility. However, I could just about afford a Roland 100M system. I made a few videos about it and commented on it in some of my other videos. In fact, the very first video on this channel was about the Roland 100M system. It's absolutely a terrible video. Don't watch it. But that's what it was about. Now at the time I think Roland had a system, I think it was the System 100, which was sort of a mini version of the 700. It looked like a spaceship cockpit and I really loved the design and layout. However, they had also released the 100M system, which was modular. It didn't look as good as the System 100, but I knew because it had patch cables that this was going to be far more flexible. So I managed to buy one of these and I had masses of fun with it. Now if you're curious about the Roland System 700, I actually do have a brochure about it and I made a video about it. If you want to check that out, I'll leave a link to that in the description. So I used the System 100M until the mid-1980s when MIDI became a thing. MIDI solved a massive problem with this older gear, which was the inability or the difficulties in connecting different pieces of gear together, particularly from different manufacturers. So I thought this old gear is going to go the way of the dodo, and I sold mine. Now I don't regret selling my 100M system. It taught me a lot about synthesis, particularly subtractive synthesis. I had at the time, I think I may still have them, I had a series of books by Roland which explained a lot about the System 100M modules and subtractive synthesis in particular. If you were interested in learning more about subtractive synthesis or the Roland 100M system, someone has created digital copies of these and I made a video about this as well. It is absolutely one of the best resources I've come across for learning analog synthesis. I should leave a link to that too in the description. So I think my interest in synthesizers and knobs and levers and sliders to play with and twiddle quite possibly stemmed from my fascination with mad scientist laboratories which I watched on movies as a kid. And that sort of nerdy approach, if you like, also fed to my interest for computers. And of course the 1980s was the decade of the home computer boom. So I don't know if this makes any sense to you, but more importantly and perhaps more interestingly, I'd be really interested to know if you can trace your fascination or interest in synthesizers back to a particular point, perhaps not even synthesizer related. But if it is, and I do know many people trace their interest in synthesizers to seeing their first synthesizer or seeing a synthesizer and just being fascinated by the controls and the sound, I'd be really interested to know if you can trace your initial fascination in synthesizers to a particular instrument or a particular time or something which happened or something which you heard. Let me know in the comments. I hope you found this interesting, possibly mildly entertaining. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed it, there are a couple of buttons you might like to click on just below this video. That would be very much appreciated. In any event, thank you again. I will see you again in the next video.